Hello and welcome to the Grid Podcast. We are back with your podcast about our electricity networks and their role at the heart of our transition to net zero. Today we are talking about SF6 and how basically the transition and move away from SF6 might affect our wider kind of transition towards net zero. And well, straight away, I've just come out with another industry 3-letter acronym. So let's just get straight into it. I'm here with David McDonald and let's kick off. What is SF6?
Right, so SF6, I'm not a switchgear expert by any stretch of the imagination, but SF6 is sulfur hexafluoride. It's in its purest form, it's a colourless, odourless gas. It's used hugely across transmission and distribution switchgear from sort of 11 kV upwards. It's extremely effective at quenching electrical arcs. That's why it's great. And you don't need that much of it. So it means switchgear can be small.
So effectively, sulfur hexafluoride, that's the acronym SF6. And it's a gas that goes in most switchgear that we pretty much use from 11 kV right up into transmission switchgear.
Yeah, so like for the last 20 years, we've kind of moved from oil insulated switchgear mostly into this SF6 space. There is vacuum as well. And those three things are playing out now in various different ways. But SF6 was probably the main type of insulation and switchgear over the last 20 years in the industry.
Yeah, I think that's right. Pretty much any bit of switchgear you go to buy is SF6 really. Well, subject to what we're about to talk about then. So it's obviously very, very good at what it does. It's allowed switchgear manufacturers to make kit smaller and more efficient because it is so good at quenching that high voltage arc when your circuit breaker is trying to break that fault current and there's the big kind of arc sparking across it. It's really, really good at what it does. Allows you to make all that kit much smaller. That means, less materials, less land tech, just more efficiency overall, really.
Yep.
Well, what is wrong with SF6 then?
Okay, so why do we want to move away from it? Well, we're back to kind of net zero, and the impact actually is probably one of the most potent greenhouse gases that there is. It's 23,500 times more potent than CO2. So it has a huge impact.
Not good then?
Not great stuff from a greenhouse gas effect, and a huge impact on the planet. So the plan is to move away from that. There's been various dates talked about, various bans talked about, but ultimately the direction of travel is we need to move away from using SF6 and that we need to look at alternatives out there in the marketplace.
I think it's something it's got like a 3,200 year lifespan as well, so it's not something that's going to disappear quickly either.
It doesn't die quickly, and it's it's pretty. You're testing my chemistry now, but it's a pretty nasty gas to have out there. And one of the things that the DNOs actually are, through F-gas regulations, so there's regulations in place, they monitor how much leakage there is of this. And that's one of the things they're working on while these alternatives and making sure that the leakage is low.
Yeah, so it's very good at its job in insulating, but it is, if it gets out into the atmosphere, it's bad. It's fine if it's all contained and looked after. But it's those leakage rates, which, as you say, under regulation, DNOs have to monitor leakage rates, report on them. But that's all just part of a bigger, it's both a legislative and regulatory trend, but also driven by DNOs and manufacturers. Everybody's kind of playing a part in, everybody knows we need to get away from it.
Totally. I mean, it's not dissimilar to the EV move. It was one, 3 or 4 years ago, it was talked about. We're now seeing the legislation, the regulation move that way, and we're starting to see, but like the car manufacturers, we're starting to see all the switchgear manufacturers look at the alternatives and see which one they can get that's going to give them the advantage in terms of selling into the electrical and particularly the utility industry.
Okay, brilliant. So we've covered what SF6 is. We've covered what's bad about it, what's good about it, and why it's changing. So I suppose the whole purpose of the podcast then is the next bit really, and it's looking at those impacts. This transition away from SF6, sort of where's it going to impact, and then we'll lead into a conversation. I suppose if I'm a project developer, maybe developing a solar farm or a large scale kind of energy storage or a very electricity intensive factory that's electrifying away from gas. What are the things I maybe need to think about, or how might I be impacted by the SF6 transition?
Yep.
And so I suppose let's look at maybe the state of play or chat about the state of play today. So obviously the main driver in the industry we're in then at moving away, it's the decision the DNOs make. They set their standards on what equipment they will or won't allow. So that they're probably the first protocol.
Totally.
Obviously, they rely on manufacturers and partnerships with different manufacturers producing the technology. But sort of where are we at in terms of where the GB DNOs today?
So the rules are there are no rules. We're not just quite at that stage. The direction of travel is definitely to, long-term direction of travel. Everybody is saying from a strategic perspective that they want to remove SF6 from their asset base. That's broadly driven, as we've talked about, around change in regulation, et cetera, potential bans that may be coming in. But everybody is a slightly different variant of that. Some are more aggressive and want to move quicker. Some are less aggressive. Some want to see what's out there in the marketplace. I think the general concept, though, is when they move away from SF6 plant, there has to be both a commercially and sort of physically viable alternative. One that works technically, two that doesn't take up 3 times the room of the current switchgear, and also that it's commercially viable, like it doesn't cost the earth.
Yeah, like before we get to the sort of implications for project developers, like just in broad DNO terms, if you've got an old substation that's confined, let's in a city somewhere where you've got neighbours in sort of 4 sides of you can't expand your land tech, and you need to replace the switchgear in there with SF6 free. But if that switchgear is bigger because we can't get an insulating medium that fits in as small, that could mean replacing that switchgear might not just be simple as going in and changing gear. It might need a whole new land tech, trying to locate a whole substation location within a city. Very quickly you're looking at millions and millions of pounds there. The impact could be huge.
Well, where you're trying to get to is like sort of if you're thinking like a smaller package substation, oil insulated switchgear, the old oil ring main units, were broadly the same size as the new SF6 alternative. Now, there's other issues with oil, as many of us will remember, for in terms of maintenance and oil sludging. There's whole lots of different things in that space. Also, some safety concerns, and those can all be managed the same as there's things you have to manage with SF6. So a few of the DNOs are in that space. Well, if there's no alternative, well then is oil also an option, because they are, they technically work. Physically, the space is about the same. But again, there's negatives there that seen us transition to SF6. So to go back seems a bit of a strange step, but it might be something that's considered by different people, just depending on how they view the risks.
Yeah, there was obviously reasons asset managers moved away from oil insulated gear, and you've touched on some of them around maintenance and various different bits and pieces. So I suppose part of what maybe becoming a bit apparent in this conversation, it's the environmental concern has probably risen over the last 20 years. So that's now a bigger factor on an asset manager's kind of criteria when you're looking at kit. But it has to be weighed up against all these other factors. How big is it? Is there more land tech that is going to make certain projects unviable? Is it more expensive? Is it longer lead time? All sorts of health and safety implications around, like oil's presumably a bit more of a fire risk, whereas SF6 isn't a fire risk at all.
Yep.
So,
and you have alternatives there, even in the oil space, where you can use there's lots of different alternatives that you need to consider and sort of take the whole thing, as an asset manager should take a view of the risk right across the piece. But as you say, the environmental risk has become greater, and actually, to a stage where you might actually have to just remove it from all your gear. And just to say, I suppose this isn't a retrospective thing. So all the switchgear that's out there has to be managed, and the SF6 has to be managed, and the leakage rates still have to be managed in that. So nobody's going backwards here. But as you continue to replace your switchgear, and realistically, it's probably 10 or 15 years down the line before a lot of that SF6 gear would even be coming up for replacement, a 40, 50 year lifespan. So that's where we're at.
Albeit I do know there was a lot of big concerns being raised with the people, particularly at EU level, setting regulation and legislation around big concerns about, well, hold on, if we need spare parts for some of the kit we have and this sort of thing, especially if phasing out SF6 means a whole new substation that might take 10 years to deliver. You still need the manufacturers to be able to produce parts and things. So there's a lot of nuance and debate around all that as well.
But there is some general rules in terms of where we've got to. So very broad brush. Switchboards generally have alternatives that are commercially viable, physically the same size. So maybe at 11 kV and at 33 kV, there are alternatives out there in the marketplace, and you'll see some of the DNOs have said only those alternatives, no SF6 in that space. The things that are trickier is at transmission voltage levels, 132 and upwards, and ring main units. There is some alternates out there, but they are much bigger. And I know the ring main unit sort of manufacturing industry is really looking at getting that medium or a gas that can perform like SF6 at the same size. So those developments are out there, but we haven't seen them really hit the marketplace yet.
Yeah. And just before we go into maybe a little bit of like, well, what to be aware of if you are developing, as I said, like sort of energy transition projects. One of the other things before we kind of leave the topic of what the DNOs are doing, it probably is worth touching on. There's a common theme, all the DNOs in Rio ED2, which is their next kind of business planning cycle. It started back in March, April this year. Everybody's committed to getting away from SF6, but each of the DNOs are kind of having different plans around that. So it's just worth reiterating that piece that I think you already said. Some of them are quite conservative. Some of them take a fairly dim view of what's on the market today, whereas some of them are at the very other end of that and are jumping in at, everything into like rolling out SF6 switchgear at 132 the whole way down through today, which we'll come on to now, does have some implications. So yeah, we'll move on then. Basically, if you're sitting there developing a large, sort of energy transition project, there's probably a bit of a differentiation here between the kind of 132 kV and upwards voltage level, and then sort of 33 kV in the middle, and then kind of 11. Each voltage level actually is a little bit different itself. Yeah. So certain impacts to look out for. So, well, if you're up at let's start with if you're up at the 132 kV voltage level. So if you're sort of 20, 30 megawatts and above. So some DNOs have just said they've moved away totally from SF6 switchgear. Some of the current issues with that is, well, space. So the switchgear can be bigger and it can mean a bigger land tech. And that can have a knock-on impact then on your planning permission. So if you've put in a 132 kV substation design as part of your battery scheme or your factory scheme or whatever it is, and you've allocated land for that at the corner of the site, and that's went into planning, well, if you all of a sudden need to find yourself using bigger equipment or switching from like a dead tank to a live tank circuit breaker, and then you need externally mounted CTs and all that sort of thing, changes substation layout, can make it a bit bigger. And especially if you've kind of got a confined site where that substation was relatively nailed on and you don't have much room, that could have quite a big impact on your project, as well as any planning amendments to reconfigure that substation as well. So you might find that you're coming ready to build, and then you find you might have another 12 months to wait between lead time and sorting planning out. Yeah,
and that lead time piece is a really tricky piece in all of this, because and it's a tricky one for DNOs as well. Lead times and switchgear, as can be, we've mentioned in this podcast before, the big stuff, it could be 9 to 12 months, maybe slightly more than that in certain occasions. So for new gear, non-SF6, those lead times might even be further extended. So you have a time impact. But equally then, there's a piece about how this transition works as well. So say a DNO decides in 6 months' time that, they want to go to non-SF6 completely across their range of switchgear. And it's something we've been chatting to some DNOs about. There has to be a policy in place. If you've ordered your switchgear 9 months out, you want to make sure that can still be installed. So there has to be like a transition period. And it's hard to find the balance in that, because the DNO, if they've decided not to order any new, they don't want to let new stuff come on. But equally, if you've committed to a project and it's been approved, then that has to sort of see its way through, unless it was really trying to extend it time frame. So there's a whole tricky balance around how we manage this going forward.
Yeah, so I was going to point one we've made is around the land tech and then any planning impact of changing the design of the whole, because the switchgear change can change your design of the whole substation. And then that point two, really summarising up, is being very careful before procurement, which is a bit odd, because we're obviously day and daily advising people,
get your orders in.
Get orders in, because long lead kit is typically the if you're waiting a year for a piece of switchgear, that's typically the thing that's critical path in your project. But there has to be that extra level of care taken now, because DNOs are changing policy. They're all changing policy at different speed. They're all, I'm sure all of their asset managers are currently analysing all sorts of different kit out in the market at the minute, probably going through certain tests and factory acceptance and everything else. And those policies are changing. It really is moving. We've seen a number of policies change in this, and they continue to change on a very regular basis. So you do need to be very careful with that, is that you don't go and decide you're going to order a load of breakers for your on-site substation and then next thing find that the DNO won't accept them.
Yeah, particularly if you don't have any DNO engagement. I think the key thing is have that engagement with them to say, we're placing orders now. We've got design approval, or we're going to be coming for design approval. Are you happy enough with this?
And then I suppose, that both of those aspects apply to 33 kV as well. Some of the non-SF6 33 kV switchboards might be a little bit bigger. So again, it's just that bit about land tech and designing the substation in, and if it does need to get bigger and that impacts planning or whatever.
I think in that space we probably have more detail. We kind of know what the alternative looks like. So both commercially and physically. So those, they're out there. It's the ones that are in that development stage where it's very hard to say, well, is a package substation going to need to be 50% bigger, 20% bigger? Is it fine the way it is? And the same for the big stuff. And
then I suppose just dropping down voltage level. So is it fair to say, maybe this is a stupid question, is it fair to say at the higher voltages we're highly unlikely to see anything oil insulated coming in there?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so sort of 33 kV 132, you're not going to see anything oil insulated. But at 11 kV, that's where you might see a move.
You might see some viable alternatives there as oil for a period of time.
Yeah.
Again, that brings more maintenance and and other things to consider. But I think it is a viable.
Because I know one DNO in the UK has moved back to oil RMUs, and I suppose one thing we've kind of picked up in a couple of projects is, well, there's a bit more in your fire risk assessment then as well. Obviously, oil poses a bit of a fire risk. You've got integral substations and that sort of thing.
And what some of the DNOs, and I don't know the detail of this, but they may be considering more like remote switching of those units or whatever, like via SCADA potentially with actuators, or they may be looking at some kind of lanyard system. All those things need to be considered as part of that. But again, oil is not an uncommon thing that's used in the industry. It's in your transformer anyway. So, everybody will have pluses and minuses, thoughts on operating it, not operating it, how you do it. But there's mitigations you can put in place to make that a viable approach if that's something you want to consider. Equally, other people think that'll be a very backward step.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've probably covered the main bits, really. I suppose just to summarize, if you are developing a project today, this is particularly pertinent to, I know a lot of the people in the renewables and battery industry are all caught up now with these 2030 plus connection dates. Yeah. And it is a hard one. It's like, well, if you're trying to get planning permission and stuff in place, well, they've already got a lot of issues around planning expiry dates, typically expires within 5 years and all sorts of things. And then it's like, well, how do you put forward a robust design into planning, taking account of what the substation is going to look like as well? So it is just it's another thing to be aware of. I suppose at this point in time, all we can do is highlight it. You can kind of factor in maybe a little bit of extra space if you can around your substation. You can start to look at, well, some of the DNOs that have been on the front foot on this stuff, look at the kit they're using, potentially look to, what would the design impact be there and design that in.
Totally. And there's ultimately maybe even a debate about air insulated switchgear versus, indoor actual switchboards versus outdoor gear. So there's another play in that as well, what the alternative might look like. But yeah, plenty to be considering. So I think it's just making sure you know that it's out there.
Exactly. Okay. Thanks for that, David. I think that was really useful. Just as a bit of a roundup in other news, just very quickly before we go. So in terms of future podcasts, just tying in with all our news then. So we had the current Prime Minister anyway. I say current as of sort of September, October 2023.
I'm not trying to get too political in this podcast.
It might change quickly. So Grid Connections was in the news. He came out and said we're going to move away from a first come, first serve grid connection process. So our interpretation, I suppose, is that's going to mainly apply to sort of generation and large battery storage, right. Very large schemes, I'm assuming, as part of the whole transmission capacity crunch that we have covered. So we'll come back and kind of have a look at, well, what might a not first come, first serve system look like? Yeah. And if we sort of look at one of our closest neighbours in the Republic of Ireland, they operate a very different system.
Kind of batch type approach.
So that might help inform. If I'm sure there's going to be a lot of industry consultation around this. So that might help inform people that'll be feeding into the consultations and different industry stakeholders on what all our systems can look like and sort of the pros and cons.
Yep.
So we'll come back and we'll do that. I have been repeatedly saying we're going to come back with another transmission capacity crunch podcast. That will be part of it. In truth, part of it has also been National Grid set out a lot of plans that we were hoping to come into place, and they haven't really quite happened on time. So we had things like their connection plan assumptions were supposed to be early this year, got moved back to August. Not really sure when the date is for that now. The tech amnesty, I think, was supposed to complete quite early. I think it's maybe even held up a little bit, but last I heard there's 8 gigawatts in it, and it's with Ofgem for approval, so hopefully that comes through. And to be fair, the DNOs have done a good job pushing on getting technical limits. So we might come back with a podcast on technical limits that should allow some DNO connections to proceed. And then any other news roundup? I suppose there was the connection charging reform.
Yeah, from Northern Ireland perspective, you had the connection charging reform call for evidence.
So for any GB listeners who think they have it hard off, people in Northern Ireland they have to pay full reinforcement if you're a connecting customer. Whereas obviously anybody developing GB will know that the costs, they had been shared and now they're largely being picked up with the DNO, subject to a few caveats that we've touched on a different podcast as well. And
yeah, I think that's generally it. We've responded to that. We'll keep you updated on how that moves on for those of us that are based here as well in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so I suppose, thanks for listening. We will be back. We'll be back looking at those few topics. Please get in touch, like or subscribe, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Do feel free to reach out to us, pose any questions, throw in any topics you'd like covered, and we will be back in the not too distant future with our next podcast.
Thanks very much. Cheers.